It is 1854 in coastal Georgia, where the salt air drifts through the pines and the weight of bondage hangs heavier than the summer heat. On the sprawling Hensley plantation stands Josiah, a man in his early 30s, born into chains, yet carrying the quiet dignity of someone who remembers what freedom must feel like. His hands are scarred from labor, but his eyes hold a depth the overseers fear, a depth that refuses to die. The Hensley household treats Josiah as more than a field hand, yet far less than a man. Inside the mansion's polished walls, he is ordered about like a silent instrument, a servant expected to hear everything and say nothing. For years he has endured the crushing pressure of obedience, forced proximity to people who own his body but will never touch his spirit. The house, with its candlelit hallways and echoing rooms, is a cage disguised as civility. But tonight, something shifts. A storm creeps over the marshlands, thunder pressing against the horizon, and in the midst of that simmering darkness, Josiah will face a moment that forces him to choose between survival and resistance, a moment that will carve his name into the quiet ledger of the enslaved who dared to fight back. The night settled over coastal Georgia like a heavy shroud, its humid breath clinging to the walls of the Hensley plantation house, as though the air itself feared to move. Josiah walked the long corridor with practiced quiet, his footsteps swallowed by the worn floorboards, polished by generations of forced labor. Yet even in that silence, he felt an unrest rising inside him, a slow, pulsing thrum that matched the distant rumble of thunder building over the marsh. The storm's approach cast the world in a strange, hushed tension. The candles lining the hallway flickered with a restless unease, their flames bending low as if bowing to a truth they sensed before he did. Josiah's breath steadied, not out of calm, but out of the discipline carved into him by years spent in service to a household that owned the walls, the light, and every inch of the life he moved within. But tonight, something in the air pressed differently against his skin, as though the approaching darkness carried a message meant for him alone, a whisper that freedom, even if only in thought, had begun to stir. He paused near the tall window overlooking the fields, the pane vibrating slightly beneath the growing wind. Outside, the land, stretched out in muted tones, cotton rose, trembling under the restless sky, the workers' cabins hunched low like weary silhouettes, bracing for what the storm might bring. Josiah watched the horizon split briefly with white fire, illuminating the ancient oaks and the winding road leading toward the river. In that sudden light, he glimpsed the edges of the world beyond the plantation, the world he had only heard about in whispered conversations exchanged in the dark, where hope and fear intertwined like vines. As the thunder rolled across the fields, he felt a pull in his chest, a longing he rarely allowed himself to name. For years, he had taught his heart to be quiet, to survive beneath the weight of the household's demands. But the storm seemed determined to shake loose what he had buried, awakening a restlessness that no command could silence. The air inside the corridor thickened as the first drops of rain struck the roof, a steady, growing rhythm that echoed down the wooden beams like a warning. Josiah continued forward, the dim lantern light painting a soft glow along his arms and casting a long shadow behind him that swayed with each step. That shadow felt strangely alive tonight, fuller, more defined, as though it belonged not to a servant moving under strict expectation, but to a man standing at the threshold of a moment he could not yet see. He tightened his grip on the small task he carried, the simple object in his hands suddenly, feeling heavier than its weight. The world around him seemed to hold its breath as the storm pressed closer, its voice swelling across the sky. In that trembling stillness, Josiah sensed the faintest shift in the air, a fragile but unmistakable truth settling over him like a mantle. The life he had endured for so long was beginning to loosen its hold. Something was coming, and when it arrived, he would not meet it as he had met every day before. The dining room awaited him like a chamber carved out of a another world. Polished silver catching the trembling candlelight, portraits watching from the walls with the cold detachment of those who believed themselves eternal. The storm's first true swell pressed against the window panes, warping the glass with each heavy gust. But inside the room everything remained staged in its familiar, oppressive stillness. Josiah stepped across the threshold with the quiet precision expected of him, though each movement felt strangely heightened tonight, as if the air around him had deepened in weight and meaning. The mistress sat rigidly at the far end of the table, her fingers drumming a restless pattern against the polished surface, while the master leaned back in his chair with a brooding stillness that often preceded some new cruelty. Their silence was thick, charged, as though the storm had seeped into their bones as well. He moved to light the final candle beside the hearth, its flame wavering timidly before rising into a steady glow. Behind him, the master's voice cut through the room, slow and sharp-edged, calling Josiah's name not as one calls a man, but as one summons an object. Josiah turned, lowering his gaze with a steadiness honed by years of survival. The master began to speak of chores unfinished, of expectations unmet, weaving his reprimands through the air like barbed wire designed to remind Josiah of his place. The mistress watched, her eyes following every flicker of emotion she imagined across Josiah's face, searching for cracks that were never given the luxury to form. The tension between husband and wife hummed beneath their words, a household bound not by harmony, but by the fraying threads of pride and resentment. When the thunder struck again, its force rattled the silverware on the table, and for a brief moment all three looked toward the window, as if the sky itself had entered the room. The mistress flinched, her composed facade splintering as fear flickered across her face, but the master only hardened, the shadows sharpening along his jaw. Josiah felt the room shift, a subtle tilt in the balance, as though the storm outside had dragged their hidden tempests into the open. In that moment, with lightning etching the room in stark white for a heartbeat, he felt a quiet certainty rise within him. The household's fragile order was beginning to crack, and in its cracking, something long buried inside him stirred, stretching like a limb, waking from years of numbness. Tonight, he sensed, would not pass quietly. The storm deepened its voice as Josiah stepped back into the hallway, the walls trembling faintly beneath each rolling crash of thunder. The house felt alive in a way it never had before, its long corridors breathing with shadows that stretched and recoiled with the flicker of every candle. He moved with careful steps, yet his heartbeat no longer followed the rhythm of obedience. Something inside him had begun to shift, subtle but undeniable, like a rope long pulled taut finally beginning to fray. Down the hall, the faint echo of raised voices spilled from behind a closed door, the master and mistress beginning one of their familiar quarrels. Their anger rose and fell in jagged waves, sharp enough to cut through the wooden panels, yet Josiah felt distant from the sound, as if he were listening from outside his own life. The storm's howl pressed itself into the house, merging with their discord until it was impossible to tell where nature's fury ended and human bitterness began. He paused at the base of the staircase, the banister cool beneath his calloused palm. From here, he could see the open doorway leading to the back porch, where rain now fell in sweeping sheets, turning the yard into a blur of silver and shadow. Beyond the porch, the fields churned beneath the wind, the cotton bending like a congregation forced into prayer. Josiah watched the storm claim the land with unapologetic power, its wild freedom stretching across the horizon in a way that made his throat tighten. The world outside these walls was raw, unpredictable, and vast, everything this household feared. He could almost feel the pull of it, like an unseen hand reaching through the rain to remind him that he belonged to something greater than the narrow path carved for him inside this mansion. The longing pressed against his ribs, a steady ache he had never allowed himself to feel so fully before. A sudden crash from upstairs snapped his attention back, followed by the sound of hurried footsteps footsteps, and a door slamming shut. The mistress's voice rose, sharp with accusation, and the master's reply thundered back, drenched in bitterness. Their conflict spilled out like a wound reopened, and Josiah sensed the household cracking along its hidden seams. He stepped away from the staircase, instinct pulling him forward as the storm's light flashed across the walls, illuminating his silhouette like a figure caught between two worlds, the one he had been chained to and the one calling him from beyond the rain. As he moved deeper into the house, a single truth echoed inside him with quiet certainty. The night was unfolding into something that would not be forgotten, and whatever waited at its end, he would no longer face as the man he had been before the storm began. The house groaned softly as the storm pushed against it, each gust of wind bending the old timbers with a sound like weary bones recalling their burden. Josiah stepped into the service passage near the kitchen, the narrow corridor dim and close, carrying the scent of damp wood and simmering broth left cooling on the stove. Here, away from the polished halls and scrutinizing eyes, the air felt different, less suffocating, more human. The glow from a single lantern cast a trembling circle of light beneath his feet, its fragile warmth battling the encroaching shadows. He lingered for a moment, listening to the rain drum against the roof, feeling the storm's persistence resonate through the boards beneath him. It reminded him of nights in the quarters when elders would whisper stories older than bondage itself, tales of spirits woven through thunder, urging the oppressed to stand, to move, to remember. Tonight, those stories felt closer than ever, brushing against him like invisible hands, guiding him toward an unseen threshold. He reached for a jug on the shelf, its cool clay slick beneath his fingers, but paused mid-motion as a sound drifted from the far end of the passage, soft, hesitant, carrying a tremor that did not belong to the storm. A voice, low and unsteady, calling his name with the weight of someone seeking refuge. Josiah recognized it immediately. It was Clara, one of the housemaids, her voice strained by a fear she rarely allowed to surface. She emerged from the shadows, her shoulders drawn tight, her apron damp from the humidity and spilled water she had dropped somewhere in her haste. Her eyes darted toward the ceiling where the master's heavy steps echoed in uneven rhythm. "He's in one of his moods," she whispered, her voice trembling like the flame trembling in the lantern's glass, "and the storm's only making it worse." Josiah felt the words settle inside him with a grim clarity, each syllable threaded with a warning he had lived long enough to recognize. He stepped closer, lowering his voice as the lantern's light wrapped them both in a fragile cocoon. Clara's breath shook as she leaned against the wall, the fear in her eyes mirroring the unease stirring in his chest. In the distance, a door slammed again, followed by the master's voice rising in harsh, jagged tones. The storm roared outside in answer, its fury matching the turmoil brewing within the household's walls. Josiah felt his pulse sharpen, not out of fear, but out of a growing certainty that the night was tightening around all of them. The house felt like a vessel filled to the brim, ready to overflow with a violence that had simmered beneath its civilized veneer for too long. As another roll of thunder cracked across the property, Clara's trembling hand found his for the briefest moment, a silent plea, a warning, a connection forged in shared peril. And in that fleeting touch, Josiah understood with absolute clarity. Whatever this night held, he would no longer face it in obedient silence. The wind howled anew as Josiah stepped toward the doorway leading from the service passage back into the main hall, its wooden frame quivering under the storm's relentless force. Behind him, Clara slipped back into the shadows, her presence fading like a candle shielded from sight, but not from memory. The dim corridor ahead stretched long and narrow, its floorboards gleaming faintly beneath the trembling lantern light. Every sound, the creak of the rafters, the groan of the shutters, the dragging footsteps above, felt amplified as though the house were a living thing caught between breath and breaking. Josiah steadied himself, sensing the tension thickening in the air like smoke, warning him that the night had only just begun, shaping its course. He moved toward the center of the hall, where a tall mirror stood framed in dark walnut, its surface flickering with distorted reflections of candle flames swaying swaying behind him. The storm outside cast bursts of pale light across the glass, and for a moment he saw his own silhouette illuminated in stark clarity, a man bound in body but not yet conquered in spirit. He studied that faint, wavering reflection, noticing the fatigue carved into his features, the quiet endurance in the set of his shoulders, the steady fire beginning to kindle behind his eyes. This house had taught him to fold into silence, to disappear within obedience, but in the reflection he saw something greater than submission. He saw a man standing at the threshold of a truth, waiting to be spoken, even if only through action rather than word. A sudden sound shattered his stillness, a heavy thud from the second floor followed by a muffled cry, quickly swallowed by the storm's roar. Josiah's breath caught, the faint hope of calm extinguished. Footsteps pounded across the upper landing, sharp and erratic, and the master's voice erupted in a harsh tirade that ricocheted down the stairwell like broken glass. The house trembled under the weight of his fury, each word dripping with the kind of cruelty that needed no audience to feed on itself. Josiah felt the familiar instinct to retreat, to make himself invisible, but another impulse rose to meet it, quieter, steadier, but far stronger. A line had been crossed somewhere in the night, drawn not by him, but by the rising storm and the fraying bonds of a household drowning in its own tyranny. And as the thunder rolled once more across the land, Josiah stepped away from his reflection, no longer hiding from the man he saw there. The second-floor landing groaned beneath hurried footsteps as Josiah ascended the staircase, each step measured, silent, yet driven by an urgency he could no longer deny. The storm's light seeped through the tall windows beside the stairs, illuminating the swirling dust in pale, trembling flashes. Each thunderclap pressed closer, vibrating through the banister beneath his hand, as though the sky itself demanded witness to what was unraveling inside the house. Halfway up, he paused, listening. The master's voice rumbled beyond a partially closed door, low and venomous, but another faint sound threaded through it. Something fragile, something wrong. It was the unmistakable quiver of fear, the kind that made the hair on Josiah's arms stand, the kind that whispered a truth he had always known. This house had dangers far more violent than storms. He reached the landing, where portraits of ancestors watched from the walls with cold, painted indifference. Their glass-covered eyes seemed to glisten with each flash of lightning, as though awakened by the chaos swelling beneath their silent lineage. Josiah's breath slowed as he approached the door cracked open at the far end of the hall. The candle inside had toppled, its wax spilled across the floor, casting the room in uneven shadows that moved like restless spirits climbing the walls. He could hear the master pacing, his boots scuffing the floor with impatient fury. A chair scraped violently, followed by a sharp intake of breath, not from the master. The sound lodged itself in Josiah's chest like a splinter. He had lived too long under this roof not to recognize the language of fear echoed by those with no power to fight back. He moved closer, the soft thud of his heartbeat sinking with the storm's distant roar. Inside the room, the master's voice rose in accusation, shaped by the entitlement of a man who believed the world must bend to his anger. But beneath that, Josiah detected another whisper, Clara's, shaken, barely audible, carrying the tremor of someone cornered by forces she could not outrun. The storm outside surged, its violent winds rattling the window panes as though urging him forward, refusing to let him stand idle in a night that demanded more than silent endurance. Josiah's hand hovered near the doorframe, his breath steadying in the dim hall. The threshold before him was more than a doorway. It was a boundary drawn by fear and crossed only by those ready to bear the consequences. And as the thunder cracked above like a call to arms, Josiah understood with unwavering clarity. If the night required a witness to injustice, he would no longer be one who looked away. The hall seemed to constrict around him as Josiah eased the door open another inch, the hinges releasing a soft groan swallowed instantly by the storm's roar outside. The room was dim, lit only by a single candle, struggling against the draft that seeped in through the rattling window. Shadows clung to the furniture in uneven patches, hiding shapes that only revealed themselves when lightning carved sharp lines across the floor. Josiah saw the master's back first, rigid, squared, pacing in frantic, jagged strides. His hands trembled with a fury he could barely contain, and the air around him felt charged surged with an anger that sought to devour anything in its path. Clara sat near the corner, her shoulders drawn tight, her eyes fixed on the floor, her breath shallow, as though she were trying to make herself small enough to escape the moment. The fear on her face carved a deep ache through Josiah's chest, one he could no longer swallow in silence. The master's voice tore through the room, a harsh mixture of accusation and wounded pride, the kind born from realizing that control was slipping through her fingers. He shouted about disrespect, about loyalty, about the order of things, each word laced with the venom of a man whose power relied on the obedience of those he believed beneath him. Clara flinched every time he drew near, her hands curling into fists she dared not lift. The candlelight trembled along the walls, casting their silhouettes in tall, fractured shapes that swayed with tension. Josiah took one slow step forward, positioning himself at the threshold where he could see everything but had not yet been seen. He knew this space well, the thin line between being an invisible servant and becoming the object of wrath. Tonight, that line felt too fragile to stand upon any longer. A thunderclap split the sky, shaking the glass in the window so violently the pane nearly cracked. The master spun toward the sound, his face illuminated by a brilliant flash of lightning, revealing the twisted tightness of his jaw and the ferocity spiraling behind his eyes. When his gaze drifted toward Clara again, Josiah felt something within him anchor, a resolve that had been building with every step taken through the storm-touched house. He could no longer pretend that the boundaries drawn around him were unbreakable. The world outside raged with a wild defiance, winds tearing at the land with a freedom denied to the people within these walls. And in that moment, Josiah understood. If the storm had come to loosen the chains around his spirit, he could not deny its call. He stepped fully into the room, no longer a shadow, but a presence the master could not ignore. The room tightened into a single suspended breath as Josiah stepped forward, the floorboards releasing a long, weighted creak that drew the master's attention like a spark in a powder-dry field. The master turned sharply, surprise flashing across his features before hardening into something darker, a calculating anger that curled around his expression like smoke. Candlelight trembled along the contours of his face, deepening every line carved there by power left unchecked. Josiah did not lower his gaze this time. He stood still, shoulders steady, the storm's rumble rolling behind him as though the sky itself were bearing witness. Clara's eyes widened at the sight of him, fear rising in her as she recognized the danger he had willingly stepped into, but beneath that fear flickered something softer, relief that she was no longer alone in the room. The master advanced a single step, boots thudding with a weight meant to intimidate, but Josiah did not move. The air between them pulsed, thick with unspoken histories, decades of labor, of obedience demanded yet never earned, of quiet suffering that had held the household together like mortar in its crumbling moral wall. "This ain't your place," the master hissed, pointing a trembling finger as though trying to force Josiah back into the shape of a shadow. His voice was low, simmering, with the humiliation of being challenged in his own house. The storm outside cracked through the sky again, a violent flash that threw both men into stark relief. In that moment, Josiah noticed something he had never seen before in the master's eyes: uncertainty, the small, flickering doubt of a man who sensed that the world he believed immovable had begun to shift around him. Clara's breath hitched when the master took another step, his anger sharpening into a dangerous edge. But Josiah held his ground, his presence a silent declaration that needed no weapon, no threat. It was the defiance of a man who had been pressed to the brink and had found at last the line he would not allow them to cross. The wind slammed against the window, rattling the frame, sending a gust through the cracked pane that nearly extinguished the candle. Shadows leapt across the walls as if the house itself recoiled from what was unfolding inside it. The master stopped inches from Josiah, seething, his fists tight at his sides, yet he did not strike, did not shout, did not claim the authority he had always wielded without fear. Something in the room had shifted, subtle yet undeniable. And as the thunder rolled once more, Josiah realized he had taken the first irreversible step toward the night that would define his freedom or his fate. The master's breath came in short, uneven bursts, the kind that betrayed a fury too large for the body containing it. For a long moment, he simply stared at Josiah as though trying to reconcile the man before him with the obedient shadow he believed he owned. owned. The candle sputtered again, its small flame struggling against the draught that slipped through the cracked window frame. Clara remained frozen in the corner, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, eyes darting between the two men as though watching a rope fray thread by thread. The storm outside intensified, the thunder tumbling across the sky with a force that seemed to shake loose the veneer of control the master wore like armor. Josiah felt the tremor in the floor beneath them, not from fear, but from the shifting weight of a night stepping toward its reckoning. The master's voice, when it returned, was quieter than before, but far more dangerous. "You forget your place," he murmured, each word slow, deliberate, as though selecting the ones most likely to reassert dominance. "I take one step downstairs, and they'll drag you through the yard till there's nothing left to bury. Think carefully before you stand where you don't belong." His threats, usually sharp enough to cut, felt strangely dulled tonight, their edge softened by an uncertainty neither of them could deny. The storm's light flashed across Josiah's face, revealing not defiance, but a calm carved from something steadily rising within him. Not anger, not rebellion, but clarity. He had not entered the room to challenge the master. He had entered to protect Clara, and yet, as the words pressed against him like a weight, he understood that protection had brought him to an invisible threshold no threat could push him back from. A sudden gust blasted through the window, extinguishing the candle in a hiss that plunged the room into a darkness broken only by the intermittent, jagged flashes of lightning. The master startled at the sudden blackness, his mask slipping for a heartbeat. Fear, flickering across his features before pride, forced it down again. Josiah could feel Clara's breath catch in the shadows beside him, her presence a reminder of what silence had cost them all these years. The master took a slow step backward, not retreating, but repositioning himself in a space where he could think, calculate, regain some semblance of control. But the moment had already shifted. The night, the storm, the trembling house, everything had conspired to bring Josiah to this point, and there was no path back that did. Not betray the part of himself that had finally learned to rise. In the darkness, lit only by the storm's fractured glow, Josiah realized he no longer feared the consequences of being seen. What he feared was returning to the silence he had just stepped out of. The darkness settled thickly around them, a dense shroud broken only by the lightning carving pale, fleeting strokes across the room. For a moment, everything was still. The storm held its breath. The house quieted. Even the master seemed caught in a moment of suspended disbelief. Josiah felt the cold draft sweep across his skin, carrying the scent of rain and damp earth, grounding him in a reality that felt both terrifying and strangely liberating. He could hear Clara's soft, tremulous breathing somewhere behind him, a fragile reminder of why he had stepped into danger in the first place. The silence stretched long and taut, until finally the master exhaled, a low, contemptuous sound, tinged with the sting of being challenged in a space he had always ruled without question. As the sky lit up once more, Josiah saw the master's hand move toward the desk, slow, deliberate, searching for something. Josiah shifted instinctively, placing his body between the master and Clara, a gesture so natural in its urgency that it surprised even him. The master's eyes narrowed, catching the movement, his face twisting with disbelief and fury. "You think this storm makes you brave?" he spat, his voice echoing off the wooden walls. "Ain't no thunder loud enough to drown out what you are." His words, meant to cut, instead rang hollow against the growing divide between them. Josiah stood silent, not out of submission, but out of a strength shaped in the quiet places of suffering, the kind that did not need to shout to be understood. The wind slammed against the window again, rattling the frame, as though urging the moment forward toward its inevitable fracture. The master's hand reached the edge of the desk, fingers trembling as they brushed the surface. Whether he sought a weapon or simply something to ground himself, Josiah could not tell, but it didn't matter. The threat was clear in the air, a tension coiled so tightly it felt ready to snap with the slightest breath. Clara rose unsteadily behind him, her voice barely a whisper, but filled with a pleading urgency. "Josiah, don't!" Her words hung in the dark, unfinished, swallowed by a violent crash of thunder that shook the entire room. In that instant, illuminated by a flash so bright it bleached the world to silver, Josiah saw the master master's next movement for what it was, not an act of authority, but of desperation, and he understood something profound. The night was no longer about obedience, nor even about protection. It was about choosing the man he would be when the storm passed, when dawn returned, when the price of silence could no longer be paid. The lightning faded, leaving the room plunged once more into a darkness so complete it seemed to press inward from all sides. Josiah heard the master's breath, sharp and uneven, felt the shift of movement across the wooden floor as he steadied himself against the desk. The storm outside roared with renewed force, the wind battering the windows until the glass vibrated like a held note. In that suffocating dark, Josiah sensed the invisible line between them twist and tighten, a line drawn by centuries of domination and upheld through fear. Yet tonight, that ancient boundary felt fragile, trembling, as though the storm had reached inside the walls and found the weak points that humanity had carved into this place. Josiah stood unflinching, the darkness no longer something to shrink inside, but a mantle wrapped around him like quiet armor. Another flash tore across the sky, and in its brief glow, Josiah saw the master's face contorted with something more layered than anger, a mingling of disbelief, humiliation, and a rising dread that he might no longer command the fear he had relied upon. His hand hovered near a drawer in the desk, fingers twitching, hesitation betraying him. Clara's soft gasp trembled through the shadows, urging Josiah to act without uttering a single word. But action did not come in the form of violence or force. Instead, Josiah took a step forward, slow, steady, deliberate, not toward the drawer, not toward aggression, but toward the truth of himself, toward the strength he had never been allowed to wield openly. The master jerked back in startled instinct, colliding with the desk, his hand recoiling from the drawer as though the storm itself had struck him. That single flinch was enough to shift the balance in the room. The thunder rolled again, but this time it seemed to echo inside Josiah's chest, deep and resonant, like a drum calling him toward a destiny he had long been denied. He stood tall, shoulders squared, and met the master's gaze without fear, a gaze that wavered, flickered, then faltered entirely. Outside, the wind pushed against the house with the fury of an ocean, but within the room, a deeper stillness settled, the kind that follows a decision too great to be undone. Clara watched from the shadows, her eyes wide, the tremble in her hands easing as she realized the truth unfolding before her. Something had broken in the master tonight, not his authority, that might rise again with the dawn, but the illusion of his absolute control. The storm had taken that from him, and Josiah had claimed what filled the void. Not dominance, not rebellion, but the first breath of freedom inside the confines of a room built to crush it. The storm's wrath peaked as if answering the silent uprising unfolding within the wall. Lightning licked across the sky in jagged streaks, illuminating the room with harsh, fleeting clarity. In one such flash, Josiah saw the master fully, shoulders drawn tight, breath shallow, eyes rimmed with a fear he could no longer mask. The man who once towered over every soul on the plantation now seemed smaller, diminished not by force, but by the realization that his authority was no longer absolute. Josiah felt the shift in the air, felt the silent weight of generations behind him, those who had bowed, endured, and survived, lending their strength now to the one who dared stand. The darkness returned after the lightning faded, but Josiah no longer feared it. The storm had revealed too much to allow shadows to rule him again. Clara rose from her corner, her trembling softened by the presence standing between her and danger. Her steps were hesitant at first, then steadier, as though she too sensed that something foundational had changed in the world around them. She approached the edge of the flickering shadows, her hands clasped in front of her, her eyes fixed not on the master, but on Josiah, the one anchor in the chaos. Outside, branches scraped violently against the window, a sound like nature's own call to movement, to upheaval. The master's jaw clenched, his pride shuttering his fear, but he did not step forward. He did not speak. He did not command. The silence that emanated from him now was not one of power, but of defeat, a temporary retreat perhaps, but a retreat nonetheless. It trembled in the air like a fragile thread pulled loose from the fabric of certainty. Josiah inhaled deeply, the scent of rain and old wood filling his lungs, grounding him. The room felt different now, less like a cage, more like a threshold. He sensed that the night had not finished shaping itself, but the direction of its course had irrevocably changed. Clara's hand found the edge of his sleeve, resting there lightly, seeking reassurance and giving it at the same time. Somewhere within the house, a shutter slammed open, the wind howling through the lower hall like a restless spirit freed from confinement. The master flinched at the noise. Josiah did not. That single contrast spoke louder than any confrontation could. For the first time, he felt himself standing not as a servant, not as a shadow, but as a man fully present in his own rising. And as thunder tore the sky with one last overwhelming roar, Josiah understood that the storm outside was no longer the one he feared. The storm within the house had finally broken, and he was the one still standing. The storm began to drift eastward, its fury easing into a steady downpour that thudded against the roof like a weary drum. But inside the house the tension did not soften, it only changed shape. The quiet that followed felt heavier than the thunder that came before it, a silence swollen with consequences not yet spoken. Josiah stood in the dim room, the faint glow from the hall spilling through the cracked door and brushing his outline with soft golden edges. The master remained pressed against the desk, his breaths shallow, each one drawn as though it tasted of a world he no longer fully controlled. Clara stepped closer to Josiah, the hem of her dress whispering across the floor, her eyes fixed on the man who had shifted the axis of the night with nothing more than presence and courage. The house seemed to listen, its heartbeat steadying, its secrets trembling just below the surface. Josiah turned slightly, enough to see Clara in the soft light filtering through the hall. Her face carried the marks of fear, but beneath that fear was a quiet strength he had always noticed but never fully understood until now. Her trembling had subsided, replaced by a stillness that felt anchored in trust, not only in him, but in the fragile possibility that the walls closing around them might, for the first time, begin to crack outward instead of inward. She reached out, her fingers brushing the back of his hand, a gesture small and delicate yet filled with the weight of years lived under someone else's shadow. That touch, subtle as it was, steadied him. It reminded him that he was not standing alone on the precipice of this night. There were lives interwoven with his, lives that had learned to survive by silence and endurance, now watching what courage could look like when it finally stood upright. Behind them, the master finally found his voice, not the booming authority he once wielded, but a quieter, injured rasp. "Get out," he muttered, the words brittle, collapsing beneath their own bitterness. It was not a command, it was a retreat, the first Josiah had ever heard from him. The master's gaze dropped, avoiding Josiah's completely, as though unable to bear witness to the truth revealed in the storm's harsh illumination. It was a moment Josiah knew would linger between them long after the night had passed. He stepped back slowly, guiding Clara with him, their movements calm, deliberate. The power in the room had shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but irrevocably. And as they stepped into the hallway, the last flicker of candlelight behind them, Josiah felt the weight of the house lifting off his shoulders bit by bit. The night had not ended, but something inside it had broken loose, setting the course for what must come next. The hallway stretched before them, dim and trembling with the fading echoes of the storm, yet carrying a new and unfamiliar quiet, the kind that settles after. Something long suppressed has finally broken the surface. Josiah guided Clara gently into the corridor, the soft lantern light brushing their faces with a warmth the house had rarely offered. The wooden floor beneath them creaked as though exhaling after years spent holding the weight of unspoken suffering. Far below, the wind continued to push against the shutters, but its voice had softened into a restless murmur, no longer the violent roar that had rattled the very bones of the home. Josiah paused, letting Clara lean against the wall, her breath steadying, her eyes bright with the recognition that they had crossed a threshold none of them could turn back from. As they stood in the lingering hush, a soft glow from the downstairs hearth cast a faint shimmer across the railing, illuminating dust motes drifting like fragile constellations in the air. Josiah looked down the length of the staircase, the house house unfolding beneath him in layered shadows. Every room held memories of quiet endurance, cleaning before dawn, whispered warnings, footsteps softened to avoid notice. But now those rooms seemed different, hollowed out by the shift in power that had just occurred. Clara straightened beside him, her trembling replaced by a quiet strength drawn from the truth of what she had witnessed. "You shouldn't have stayed," she whispered, her voice weighted with gratitude and fear in equal measure. Josiah shook his head gently. He knew there had been no other choice. Some moments demanded a man to stand, even if his knees trembled, especially then. A sudden creak at the far end of the corridor made Clara stiffen, but Josiah lifted a hand in reassurance. It was only the house settling, old timbers adjusting after the storm's assault, exhaling tension like a tired sentinel relieved of its watch. Yet even in that mundane sound, Josiah sensed an omen. Quiet did not mean safety. Not yet. The master would not forget this night. The house, for all its silence, would not forgive the shifting of its long-established order. Josiah felt the truth settle into his bones, heavy but clear. What happened upstairs had ignited a fuse that could no longer be smothered, and with the dawn would come questions, consequences, and choices that would shape the rest of his life. But as he looked at Clara standing resolute beside him, illuminated by the soft glow of the lantern, he felt a steadiness rise within him. The night was not over, but he was no longer the man who entered it bound by the weight of obedience. The storm had finally settled into a soft, persistent rain. By the time Josiah and Clara reached the lower hall, its gentle tapping against the windows sounding almost like a benediction after the night's turmoil. The hearth's fire glowed low and steady, casting long amber streaks over the walls and across the floor, where shadows pooled like dark water, retreating from the edges of the room. The house felt drained, emptied of the fury and tension that had filled it only an hour before. And yet, beneath the quiet lay a truth neither could ignore. The dawn would not bring peace, but a new shape of reckoning. Josiah paused near the center of the hall, listening to the fading storm, feeling the cool air drift through a cracked window pane. His chest rose with a slow breath, the kind taken by someone sensing that the night had changed the course of his life forever. Clara moved toward the kitchen doorway, her hand trailing lightly along the wall, as though relearning the space in this new calm. When she turned back to him, her face held an expression he had seen in the eyes of those who had survived great wounds, a mixture of gratitude, fear, and a dawning understanding of what courage could cost. "They'll come asking come sunrise," she murmured, her voice soft but steady. Josiah nodded. The truth needed no embellishment. Word traveled quickly among the quarters, and, faster still, through the veins of the house. Servants, overseers, the master himself, all would wake to the memory of a boundary crossed, and each would respond according to the fears that held them captive. Josiah felt no regret, only a quiet certainty. Some nights changed a man. This one had carved new lines into his spirit, ones that pointed away from fear and toward a horizon he had never allowed himself to see. The fire crackled softly as Josiah stepped toward the front door, drawn by the silver-gray light creeping through the narrow panes of glass. Dawn was coming, slow but insistent, brushing the sky with the faintest edge of possibility. He rested his hand on the doorframe, feeling the rough grain beneath his fingertips, the weight of decisions waiting beyond it. Clara approached, standing beside him, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. Together they looked out at the rain-soaked yard, the world washed clean by the storm, trees glistening. In the pale pre-morning glow, Josiah exhaled a deep grounding breath, steady and resolute. "Whatever comes," he said softly, not turning from the window, "I won't be who I was yesterday." Clara nodded, her voice a whisper carried by the quiet hall. "None of us will." And as the first true light of dawn broke across the earth, Josiah felt a truth settle into him like the final stroke of a bell. Freedom began not with escape, but with the moment a man chose to stand.